Hello everyone, Zero here. Tonight I will be reading Straight On Till Morning by Liz Braswell. Hopefully I'm saying that right. This is a twisted Disney tale of what if Wendy went first traveled to Neverland with Captain Hook instead of Peter Pan and Tinkerbell. Um, On this channel, I will be reading Twisted Disney books all the way through, finishing all books. I do have other types of books, not safe for work books, other fantasy books. Um, I do have a collection of Grimm fairy tales. If you would like to hear those for your bedtime stories, um, just let me know in the comments or you can message me. I'm not sure. This is my first stream or first recording. So, anyway, for tonight, I will be reading the prologue and then I will be reading chapters 1 through 3, depending on how this goes. So, without further ado, here is the prologue of Straight On Till Morning. Somewhere in Neverland. Wait, did we look over by the troll bridge? We did? What about the Tongal Spring? And the beaches around the shimmering sea? The asker of these questions was a slender young man of indeterminate age. Though perhaps if an observer looked him dead in the face, she would notice the last pockets of baby fat plumping his cheeks just above his cheekbones. His eyes and mouth and even nose wiggled and puckered with every word and thought in between, like a toddler telling a very important story to his mother. His hair was messed up and red, his eyebrows a thicker, darker red, and were his ears just a touch pointed at the tips? The one who answered his question certainly had pointed ears, though the same observer might be hard pressed to make out any ears, or actual answers at all. The boy spoke to what appeared to be little more than a golden light that bobbed and sparkled and tinkled like bells. In fact, the whole scene resembled a mesmerist quizzing a pendulum held from a long golden chain, glittering in the sunlight, whose vague swings returned meanings known only to the oculist himself. But upon looking more closely, one would see that inside the golden bubble was a tiny woman with very pointed ears, a serious face, a green dress, and sparkling wings. Her body was like a series of energetic globes, from her golden hair in its messy bun to her hips to the round silver bells that decorated her shoes. Throughout the conversation, every part of her was as animated as her friend's face. Really? We looked in all those places? Huh. Well, what about here? The boy spun suddenly and grabbed the side of a tree, as if to physically move it out of the way. Really, he was just looking behind it. But there was nothing hiding there, aside from some brightly colored lichen, a camouflaged moss, and a few grazing unicorn beetles. From this sudden motion and burst of energy to dead exhaustion, the boy slumped, strangely drained by disappointment and exertion. He slid down to the base of the tree, causing at least two of the shining white beetles to flee to higher branches. The bauble of light glittered aggressively up and down. It jingled angrily. I can't anymore, Tink. I'm beat. I just. I just don't feel like it. The fairy, for that was what she was, zoomed closer, concerned, and it was when her light shone its brightest on his countenance that the most unusual detail of an already fey and wondrous scene became apparent. For no matter how intensely she glowed, no matter how perfectly yellow and dazzling the sun in the sky shone, neither source of light managed to produce a shadow of the boy. The bauble jingled in tones of hope. I don't know. We've looked everywhere. Twice. Tink, I just don't know where it could be. The bauble swayed quietly, pensively, almost as if the fairy within was in that rarest state of all for fairies, deep thought, possibly bothered by something. But the boy, even in his diminished state, still kept his attention permanently fixed on himself. He did not notice. She jingled once tentatively. Nah, I don't feel like flying. Not right now. I think I'll just rest here for a while. You go on without me. I could use a nap. Then I'll feel better. I just know it. The fairy jingled worriedly around his face. Just go look without me. He swatted her away like a gnat, sleep already overtaking his body once the decision had been made. Don't feel like flying anymore. He yawned a giant, repulsive yawn and was soon snoring. The fairy regarded him silently. She hung in a cool shadow of the generous tree, spun gently by a summery breeze. They were at the edge of the... I'm terribly sorry, I do mispronounce words and get tongue-tied easily. Wait. Dang it. God. Quisit. Come on, Zero, you got this. They were at the edge of the Quonset jungle, which was the friendliest forest in Neverland. The leaves of the trees spun every shade of golden green, and the creatures who lived there were all harmless and mostly furry. The air smelled like ripening blackberries, although it was not quite the right season, and a whisper of cool moistness hinted at a delightfully icy stream somewhere nearby. Only a fool would want to leave. Only a genius would choose to nap there. But Tinkerbell was twitchy. She had a rather dark inkling of where the shadow could be, since they had effectively proven where it could not be. And if her friend ever found out that she'd had this inkling all along, he would be very cross with her indeed. She floated silently over his face, her golden sparkles illuminating every lash, every freckle, every pore. He blew out through his careless lips, and his breath lifted up the ends of his long, shaggy bangs. She hovered above his pug nose. After debating and biting her own lip, she gave him the tiniest quick fairy kiss on it. Then she steeled herself and zoomed into the sky like a bee bent on finding his way home after a day of foraging nectar. But she was not going home. She was going to look for Peter's shadow in the scariest place of all. She was going to London. Chapter 1. London. Bear with me, everybody. Yes, it's a scene recreated so often as become almost a caricature of a trope. But let's go through the process once again anyway, because it's necessary, even to this story. Low clouds do not blanket the sky, for that implies coziness and comfort. No, these clouds mask the sky, weigh on the sky, choke the sky. They are strengthened by smoke from below. The trickling upward effluence of 100,000 chimneys that decorate the landscape like unhealthily angular flowers. The slate and clay shingled, shiggity piggity rooftops seem to extend forever in an industrial upside down version of the fairy tale hills and dales in a children's book with bright pictures and bad perspective. Everything, everything is in shades of gray and black. A great gray river slinks through the city like a tired but friendly snake, hobbled by bridges far less impressive than their names imply. Don't believe me? Look up London Bridge and gaze at it. Gaze at its pictures in utter disappointment. Of course, there's Big Ben, the giant clock with equally giant gunmetal and copper hands that an astounding number of fictional characters have wound up standing on at one time or another. Kingdom Hearts. Its bells, along with all the church bells of the city, toll the hour menacingly with the obvious mournful implication of time passing, death coming, soups getting cold. On the cobbled streets below the towers and rooftops, weather has some impact and energy. The almost rain and morning mist combine to make a wet, stinging atmosphere that has men swirling into greatcoats, nannies bundling up their charges, and mums shouting, "Come out of the garden, you'll catch your death in the fog." Also, many, many umbrellas. So many black umbrellas with the usual spindly frames, like insects or skeletons or whatever, that watching them pass is almost torturously jejun. I do not know what that means. There, London. End of one century, beginning of another. Got it? Good. Halfway between where the umbrellas ended and where the sky should have started, maybe 20.5 feet below the tallest chimney, was one particular casement window. Gazing out of it was a young woman in an unfashionable pale blue dress. Her hair was a popular shade of brown, and her eyes an exquisitely normal blue for that time and place. At first she looked up at the sky, but it was impossible to make out any shapes in the clouds because of their utter completion, filling the heavens from one end to the other in the same unbroken shade. So she looked down, but the dismal garden below soaked up by the wet like a moldy sponge. There were no puddles, no reflections. The tree was sodden. Nothing in its stolid. You got this, hero. You got this. Stop getting tongue-tied. Nothing in its stolidly real. I'm sorry. Real, real vista was alterable by even the strongest imagination. There was no foothold for pirates, fairies, golden carriages, knights, or even a hint of swashbuckling. Someone for the street had thrown a brown banana skin over the fence, and there it lay, out of place in the English garden, attesting to the banality. Big words I do not know, of global commerce, and how it didn't bring with it sultans or magic horses, only bananas. Wendy sighed and turned from the window. Afternoons were the hardest. In the mornings she still saw her tutor, and there were chores and writing exercises. After elevenses was a good improving book recommended by the bookseller, the one with a handsome nephew. By then, Mrs. Darling had usually either gone to pay visits or was busily engaged in correspondence with her delicate blue pen at her elegant secretary? Secretary? I think that's a word. Y'all, goodness gracious. The gloom never seemed to affect her, even if she did stay home all day. She was always gracefully and slowly attending to some task or other. Her face, her toiletry, her sewing. I just said sewing. Gosh, Lee. The little expense book she kept for the house, the pantry, their unpredictable cook, Mary. Wendy used to watch her mother engage in these endless circuits with delight, but that feeling was now tempered with confusion. How could someone remain so serene and glowing while working through the same indoor errands, raining day in and day out? Wendy still enjoyed it when Mrs. Darling included her in some of her feminine rituals, which usually involved the proper application of powders and creams, tips on how to polish her nails, or ideas for sprucing up an old beau. She loved it when they had extra house money to go for a fancy tea out at Saxbury's. I think I'm saying that right. Just the two of them. Wendy would admire her mother, smiling and laughing beneath her many times renewed hat, and would think once again that she was the most beautiful mother in the world. I'm sorry, I have a little bit of a cold. A little bit. Just a little bit. She wondered when she herself would attain that delicate beauty, confidence, and perfection of manner. But these outings were rare. And anyway, even the most appealing things lost their glamour when held up to the imaginary delights of Neverland. Wendy turned to her bureau. Normally she tried resisting until the end of the day as a sort of reward, like the opera creams her mother secretly indulged in. Mrs. Darling smiled so blissfully while she chewed. She She sometimes even popped one before dinner if it was an especially trying day. Often, when tempted to peek into the drawer too early, Wendy would assuage her longing by pulling out the tiny notebook she always kept with her. It had a very slim blue pencil that perfectly fit down the spine, and was nearly full of her neat, enthusiastic words. Well-thumbed pages were titled with things like Peter Pan and the Pirates and the Unsuspected Zeppelin, or Peter Pan and Tiger Lily versus the Cyclops of the Cerulean Sea. And she had illustrated Captain Hook. Oh my god, what is wrong with me? And she had illustrated Captain Hook is taught a timely lesson by Peter Pan, with a little picture of a clock she had carefully copied from the mantel, as well as the eyes and nostrils of a fierce crocodile. The rest of Hugh's body she had no hope of depicting accurately, and thus chose to submerge. But today, the words looked bleak and worn, and the empty lies beyond them seemed bleaker still. Wendy couldn't resist anymore. Not today. Not when everything was so particularly gray and dreadful and hopeless. She slid open the creaky wooden drawer and picked up an inkly soft bundle that lay neatly folded within. It shook out like a spider's web, softer than silk, and without the little catchy bits that clung to rough fingers. Its outline deformed easily. Only when she laid it out on the floor she completely flat, could she coax the shadow to its proper shape. Peter Pan. 4 years ago, Nana had torn it from the boy. For 4 years, Wendy had kept it carefully safe in her top drawer, waiting for Peter to come back and claim it. Michael and John gave up first. In the beginning, exuberant. They had been more exuberant than she at the discovery. In Michael's case, jumping and crying and genuinely bouncing off the walls. John had pushed his ridiculous glasses upon his nose and tried to speak in grown-up terms of actual evidence and irrefutable facts and the like. But weeks turned into months, into a year, into 4 years. There was no more proof, no more evidence, no more sign of a visitor from Neverland. And though the boys kept stealing quick looks at the shadow, Michael soon began to remark that it was kind of crummy and a bit faded, and John muttered darkly about manifestations of another realm and meteorological phenomena. I can pronounce that, but you know what? Ooh-wee. Somehow, astonishingly, it became just another piece of beer bric, a souvenir from an earlier time or an only slightly more exotic place, like the tiny mosaic mirror Mr. Darling had bought from a man who was traveling back to his home in Kashmir. But every night since then, Wendy had gone to sleep burning for Neverland. She hoped, the way some questionable but trendy pamphlets suggested, that if she thought about what she desired most of all before she fell asleep, she would dream of it. She drifted off, whispering, "Peter, I have your shadow. Peter." She often woke with a strange golden feeling, like she had just touched the boundaries of Neverland. Something about wolves and a strange fruit and freedom, but then quickly forgot it. The feeling never stayed. Wendy rubbed a thumb along the edge of the shadow and shuddered. If she wasn't careful, she would begin weeping. What had she done wrong? What was so repulsive about her that Peter Pan wouldn't return, even for his own shadow? What about her was so lacking that no one from Neverland ever saw her out again? She dropped the thing back into the drawer and slammed it closed, crushing a knuckle into her mouth to keep from sobbing. Soon it would be time to prepare tea, and she didn't want her mother commenting about unattractive red splotches on her cheeks or rings under her eyes. In the afternoon, her brothers came home, and things should have been better. "John, Michael," Wendy said with relief as their boyish humors and exuberance filled the otherwise silent house. "Greetings, sister," John said, handing her his hat while pecking her on the cheek with a vaguely sarcastic air. He was bound for a real university some day, perhaps even Oxford, and had already begun affecting the irony and insolence necessary for sojourn there. I am terribly sorry, y'all. Michael just kicked his boots off willy-nilly and threw his coat on a chair. Of course, other families have maids to deal with such situations, but aside from the darling's general lack of excessive funds, Wendy enjoyed the routine. At least she used to. Tisking mindlessly, she picked up Michael's jacket and smoothed it out, hanging it up properly. "Wendy, you're a damn fool for not continuing your studies within the sphere of public education," John announced, sounding like someone else. "It's heaps of fun, too," Michael growled, a stormy look on his face. He was a less subtle wielder of sarcasm than his older brother. "Well, father said none of the daughters of his clients go, and they are all very respectable girls. And anyway, I have all the time and books I need," she added, a little hollowly. It had seemed like the right choice to decline when her parents had, somewhat reluctantly, presented her with the option of attending one of the newfangled public schools. Why should she spend time cooped up in a crowded institution and be treated like a child when she could have a tutor and the putter around the house, dreaming and keeping things in order like an adult? "It's dumb. I hate it. School and its stupid rules," Michael shouted. "If you don't eat your peas, you can't have your pudding. Stupid lunch matron." "Now, Michael, I'm sure they just want you to have a nutritious, healthy supper," Wendy said, feeling the comfortable role of mother easily slide over her with its dulcet tones and indulgent smiles, banishing any uncertain feelings from the moment before. "Are there any of those French biscuits left?" Michael asked hopefully. "The ones you made? The ones I and Mother made, perhaps? I'll set out some and serve you a nice cup of proper tea while you go upstairs and bathe. And then, if there's time, I'll tell you a story before bed." "Oh, Wendy and her stories," John said with a smile, and not quite a roll of his eyes. "I have too much reading to do, like actual reading of actual history. Plus, Wendy, darling, I find your tales have a bit of Freudian bent to them these days. Have you noticed? It's all fathers and sons and missing mothers. I'm sure I have no idea what you're talking about, she said frostily. And indeed she didn't, but his tone was nasty enough. I want 3 lumps in my tea. And milk, Michael called over his shoulder as he stomped out of the room. Oh, Wendy said, suddenly remembering. Mother is supposed to come home for her dinner with Mrs. Cradapple early tonight. If you hurry, you may get to say good night to her before you turn in. Oh, yes, Mother, John said thoughtfully. Haven't seen her in ages. Tall lady, about so high. Would absolutely love to catch up with the old hen. John, Wendy said, her hands on her hips. Toodles, sister. Off to read some more Swiss psychology. You know those Swiss, all chocolate and timepieces and subtext. John made an elaborate bow and pretended to tip the hat that was no longer there. Once he was gone, Nana curled up comfortably in her early retirement by the fire, gave Wendy the sort of questioning look that only a really intelligent dog could. The way I would have beat John's butt? Yes, I see the muddy tracks they left on the floor, Wendy sighed. And no, I don't know what to do about them. Boys, they grow up so fast. Now that was an interesting idea. Neverland was full of children who never grew up. But what about a boy who grew up too fast? Literally. Like hatching out of an egg as a baby and then attaining the height of a man by the end of the day. They watched the egg with expectant faces, she murmured, trying it out. What's it gonna be? Asked Cubby. How should I know? Peter laughed. It'll be something great, though. You can count on that. Yes, that was lovely. She pulled out her little notebook. Now that her brothers no longer cared to hear Wendy's stories, she had to put them somewhere. And maybe, someday, someone would like to hear them again. Michael came back down dripping wet, and yet somehow barely clean. There was still chalk on his neck. He guzzled his tea and mandolins and stomped back upstairs to play with his lead soldiers. John hadn't bothered descending yet, probably caught up in his books about real soldiers being played in the Wars of Kings. Wendy sat by herself in the kitchen, regarding the notebooks and the abandoned and untouched tea plates. Mandolins were all the rage right now, and it had been wonderful spending the afternoon trying to make them with Mother. But after the first day, they had sort of dried out and become a little tasteless. She picked one up and tentatively dipped it in her cooling tea, then nibbled its now soft edge. Much better. It had almost tasted a little bit like sunshine, like warm, exotic days. Her mind whirled. Suddenly she saw a ship bobbing in tropical waters and herself on a beach. It was another Neverland dream she was remembering, but this one had felt so real. The sailors, pirates, were singing, and Hook was bowing from the waist, as perfect and gallant as John had been awkward and foolish. In the sunlight and open air, the captain seemed far less terrifying. But maybe it was because of the wolf at her side, the one she had befriended so long ago, growling and ready to kill for her. Maybe that why she was brave. A pity you can't stay here, the captain was saying. That rapscallion utterly abandoned you to such a dismal, grey life in London town. She had frowned. Do not talk about Peter Pan that way. You are a pirate. You make people walk the plank and burn their ships. And yet, never in my most evil and wretched moments would I abandon a lady like yourself to such a fate. He really has no heart, not even a black one like mine. I am not abandoned. He left me his shadow, she said, perhaps a little too boastfully. Hook's eyes widened at that. You have his shadow, you say? Wendy felt her lip quiver a little, but stilled it. A mistake? It is nothing to you, and I am fine. Thank you very much. After all those stories you told about him, all that time you devoted to enriching his legend, and this is how he treats you, by leaving you and making you be caretaker of his shadow, no less. Wendy, in this dream, didn't cry. She wouldn't, not in front of a villain like Hook. Wendy, with the mandolin, did. She put her head in her arms and wept herself to sleep. Hours later, she was gently awoken by the soft touches and sweet perfume of her mother, who somehow, without actually picking up the nearly grown Wendy, managed to gather her daughter in her arms and gently led her upstairs. What in the blazes is wrong with her? Mr. Darling growled. Asleep at the table like a serving wench. Shh, Mrs. Darling cooed. She gestured with her hand, making him scoop up the notebook Wendy took with her everywhere. Mother, Wendy murmured, waking a little. Oh, Mother, you look so beautiful. Thank you, dear. You're so sweet. Mrs. Darling helped her out of her dress and fixed her hair, more shadowy apparition of eyelashes in perfect coif than parent of stuff and substance. Wendy enjoyed being treated like a little girl again. She snuggled into her bed drowsily and heard her parents talk. Something's got to be done about her, Mr. Darling swore, shaking the notebook for emphasis. There's something not quite right about that girl. She's just a little blue. She needs a project, Mrs. Darling said. A boy. Or maybe a charity. A charity? How about a darling charity? Mr. Darling huffed. Courtships are all very well and good, but require dresses and hats and all sorts of expensive shenanigans. That was always the advantage of Wendy. She never wanted the things other girls had. No, Mrs. Darling said with a touch of sadness. She always wanted something else. And Wendy dreamed quickly, forgotten dreams of foreign seas and wolves. Ooh-wee. Chapter 2. In Boca al Lupo. The fact that I said that right. Wendy opened her eyes. Dreams of hidden cabins and friendly wolves and menacing pirates disappearing into the dim morning grayness. She had absolutely no desire to get up and perform the start of the day rituals she used to relish. Washing her face with fresh cold water, giving her hair 100 solid strokes before pinning it back, going through her dresses and deciding which one to wear, which one to mend, which one perhaps to embellish a little. But despite her whole bodily unwillingness to begin this process, routine took over. Habits, especially healthy ones, become easily ingrained in people like Wendy. Without even meaning to, she rose and turned and neatened her bed, smoothing the pillow out so it would look pretty and inviting when she went to lie down again that night. She drifted over to the basin of water and splashed her face without looking in the mirror, ran the brush through her hair only 57 times, and examined her nails. Dispassionately, she decided they didn't need to be buff. Moving made her feel better. Accomplishing little things gave her dim sparks of satisfaction. Before long, she had the boys up and out of bed, a whirlwind of toast and tea and brushing down jackets. Some of the brothers' energy managed to rub off on their sister, and Nana, bless her, tried to help like she used to, holding a spare white cuff in her mouth, waiting patiently and dolorously until one of the passing boys, Michael, grabbed it and patted her in thanks. It all ended when John blew an airy kiss and pulled his reluctant butler after him out the door. "Goodness," Mrs. Darling said, appearing for a moment in the foyer like a attentive daytime ghost. She was resplendent in her white froth of a nightgown, and prettily covered her mouth for a delicate yawn. "Whatever would I do without you, dear?" She kissed her daughter on the head, and Wendy fell to warm pieces under her praise. But then the figment retreated back upstairs to perform her own ablutions, and the lower house was released to the normal workday world. Wendy had toast and tea and settled down for her French lessons with Mademoiselle Gabineau. Not satisfied with her main subject of expertise, Mademoiselle also has strong opinions on history and maths, lecturing angrily and often incomprehensibly in her native tongue about the first topic while not letting Wendy give up on the second. "You must keep a house some day, with all these accounts," she admonished, "and make the right decreases when knitting a jumper." Wendy didn't deign to reply, uninterested in either applications of math. She superstitiously stroked the pages of the tiny notebook in her apron pocket and dreamed of a well-spoken, logical, and utterly evil witch. The day seemed like it was going to progress along the same lines as the one before it, and the one before that, and the one before that. But sometime before tea, there were strange noises downstairs, outer doors opening and closing, and a deep-throated male voice calling out. It was far too early for Mr. Darling to be done with business already. Concerned, Wendy tripped down the stairs as fast as she thought it decorous to do so. Nana waited at the bottom, doing something she rarely engaged in. She was growling, very softly. "Dear Nana, what is it?" Wendy asked, growing even more nervous. The dog was large, but not much of a wolf, and probably too old to do any real damage to an intruder. Oh, what a funny thought. Not much of a wolf. Wherever did that come from, I wonder? Wolves indeed. It was just prattle, but talking aloud to herself always made Wendy feel brave. And anyway, if the house was being invaded, it was up to her to defend its inhabitants and silverware. She stuck out her chin and pushed open the front hall door with a carefully imposed look of indignation on her face. "Now see here, villain!" She stopped immediately, presented with a very odd scene. Mr. Darling was home. It was rare to see him by day in a full suit, coat, and hat. Usually when he came home it was dark, and he went straight upstairs to change into his slippers and smoking jacket. He held his arm strangely, as if one were broken and he were cradling it with the other. Also unusual was that Mrs. Darling was with him, a gloved hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Mr. Darling looked utterly confused by his daughter's words, his large, bushy black eyebrows rising nearly to the top of his head. "Wendy, what in blazes was the reason for that tone? I? A villain?" "Dear, whatever is the matter?" Mrs. Darling asked with an indulgent smile. "I heard noises. I just thought. I'm so glad you're home early today, though, Father. Wait, did you hurt yourself? Did you break your arm? Is that why you're. No, if you had, Dr. Sorelio would be here with his treatments and nasty draughts. Is it some sort of holiday? I don't think I had it in my date book. Is it a birthday? Or the Banks class? Or. No! Oh no, Father! You didn't lose your job, did you? Your mother looks so radiant. That can't be. Is there other news?" Mr. Darling looked more and more blown back by the torrent of Wendy's words, as if wind were physically assaulting him. All right, he said, unable to think of anything better to quiet her. "Wendy, dear, we've bought you something," Mrs. Darling had said. Mrs. Darling said through soft laughter. "Show her." Mr. Darling moved his arms and revealed the reason he had been cradling them so carefully. At first, Wendy thought it was a rat, which would explain its size, small, its color, white, and Nana's discomfort, extreme. But then a fat little pink tongue rolled out of its mouth, and large black eyes blinked in excitement. It panted and pawed at Mr. Darling's arms, excited but obviously unsure what it wanted to do. Its little ears, no larger than the corners of a lady's pocket handkerchief, were actually quite huge compared to the thing's head, and didn't seem to be able to move very much, as they would have on a German Shepherd or Nana. "Oh," Wendy said, blinking. Her carefully read and reread books of manners for English girls and boys had nothing she could draw from for this sort of situation. "Oh, a small dog. It's a teacup terrier. Isn't it the most darling thing?" Mrs. Darling said, rubbing her face against its and kissing. Mr. Darling looked unsettled by this physical display of affection, the dry nose touching the wet one. Yes, well, all the girls seem to be into them right now, carrying them in baskets, bows in their hair, taking them to the park. I don't know. You don't hunt with them, I'm fairly certain. We just thought you could use a little friend. "We were afraid you were getting lonely in this big old dafty house," Mrs. Darling said, taking her daughter's hands and squeezing them. Wendy, so talkative before, now had nothing to say to Mr. Darling. Mr. Darling always complained about how tiny their house was, endlessly comparing it to those of his business associates and of the managers whose ranks he wanted to someday be among. Sorry, I started drooling. Okay. Drool. Alright, let's do this. Mrs. Darling never said anything obviously unkind about their home, but did often refer to it in painfully obvious terms: adorable, cozy, manageable, charming, doll-sized. "Oh, yes, lovely," Wendy said, sizing on that one point, the one that was most reasonable. Nana woofed indulgently. What was she? A piece of furniture? Her parents waited expectantly. The polite thing to do, Wendy realized, was to walk forward and put a hand out to the tiny dog and let it smell her. She made herself do so. The teeny puppy snuffed its wet nose all over her hand and seemed to lick or slurp her like a jungle creature from one of her adventure books. Something horrid that ate ants or honey or anything else that requires suckling up. It barked several times in a manner that was both strangely too quiet and somehow extremely irritating. "Thank you, Father," Wendy said, carefully removing her hand as if for the purpose of hugging him. It wasn't entirely a lie. She did indeed want to envelop Mr. Darling's large form and rest her head on his side, smelling his aftershave and his general fatherness. Her mother hugged her on the other side and kissed her on the forehead. They loved her. That was more than obvious. They just didn't understand her. Wendy did make an effort to try to see what the puppy could do, with Nana watching in stern disapproval. It would run into the middle of the room, then wag its tail like it had accomplished something truly incredible. It would run up into her arms and lick her chin. It would scamper along next to a ball that Wendy rolled. It would not make any actual attempt to stop the ball, grab the ball, fetch the ball, or do anything with the ball aside from barking at it in a teeny yip that Wendy wanted to lean over and say, "Pardon me?" Eventually, with 2 hours until the boys came home, mother and father now nowhere to be seen and nothing else to do, Wendy found an appropriately sized blanket, tied a ribbon around it, tucked in Snowball, really what else could she name it, put on her coat, and attempted an outing. She left her notebook behind, encumbered with her new pet, an umbrella. Nana also remained inside, aloof and disapproving. While she felt a little ridiculous, Wendy had to admit that the cold, slight damp air felt good on her face. Moisturizing, her mother would say. Invigorating, her father would say. The little dog peeped out of the basket and looked around blankly with no actual interest in hopping out and getting a first-hand sniff of the many wonders they passed. Wendy nodded to other walkers, most of whom regarded Snowball with amusement or delight. And then, down the path, came the demonic Shebo twins. They they were clad as they oh man, hang on. They were clad as was their wont, as were their wont, in similar dresses of different hue, similar hats with different flowers, similar parasols with different tassels, outfits just alike enough to give a nod to their sisters on oh boy. Zero, you got this. You got this. You got this. Freak. Ostensible. I cannot say this word. Saying this just a bit off to remind the viewer that they weren't the same person at all. Wendy froze and considered heading back the other way, as if she had forgotten something. She could see the steely blue of 4 Shebo eyes and didn't feel strong under their lantern gaze, especially after the caroling party last Christmas. But they had spotted her, and she had something interesting to distract them with, so maybe it would be all right. Wendy stuck out her chin and walked forward bravely to meet her fate. "Miss Darling," Clara said, with the beginnings of a coldly amused smile, "it's so lovely to see you out and about in public, especially after—" "Oh, what is it that you have there?" Phoebe cried, spotting the blanket. Him? Wendy almost blew it immediately. Was the dog even a him? She hadn't bothered to check. He's new. Oh, how perfect, Phoebe simpered, holding out a delicately curled glove finger. The puppy... Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry. The puppy... all blinking, sniffed, and she practically screamed with delight. He's adorable, Clara said flatly, to the point as always. When did you get him? Well, Wendy said, stalling. She hated the way that despite the girl's continually bad treatment of her, she was flushing and eager for any word of acceptance. Telling the specifics of the puppy's origin might spoil the chances of that happening. The house was feeling a bit lonely, don't you know? And I thought, well, what I need is a nice little companion to keep me company and to obviously indulge. Isn't he the sweetest? Phoebe cooed. I'm gratified to hear you've taken on a project like this, Clara said, tapping her parasol and trying to sound like her grandmother. Everyone was worried, you know. Worried? About me? Everyone? Oh, please, Wendy. After Christmas, it became fairly obvious what your future is. Your brothers will go to university, and you will be stuck helping your parents. And then probably care for your nieces or nephews as their spinster aunt. With cats, Phoebe added, not looking away from petting the dog. You would have cats, of course. Quite right. Lots of cats. People are talking about me as a spinster with cats. Wendy's mind was too overcome with this new information to even take offense at it. She was 16, for heaven's sake. She had time. She just moved out of the nursery not that long ago. And to think of a husband? Now? There are so many other things to think about. Balloons and submarines, airships and pirates, deepest Africa and farthest Australia, Peter Pan and fairies and mermaids and centaurs. But now this, Phoebe sighed, throwing her hands up at the dog as if there were no words. You know, Alice has a little dog too. Oh, we should all go walking together. Wouldn't that be fun? We could bring a ball or something like that. He could accompany you to one of our teas sometime, Clara said thoughtfully. We have literary ones, you know, almost like our own salon. I would like that very much, Wendy responded before she could decide whether or not that was true, or if she had even been properly invited at all. It almost sounded like Snowball was really the intended recipient of the offer. Then again, literary salon. That was a place for stories. You can obviously meet someone there, perhaps someday, Phoebe added. Someone dreamy who likes dogs, like you. It's a project, Clara said, eyes glittering. Making you acceptable and finding you a match. But you must promise not to do that thing, not to run off at the mouth the way you do. No one finds that attractive or ladylike. No one at all, Phoebe agreed. You really will end up all alone. I don't want to be alone. I have Snowball now, Wendy said, trying to make her thoughts come out the way they were flowing in her head. It didn't seem to be working. But I couldn't possibly think of a match now, and I can't help talking. I like stories and telling them. And really, isn't there another choice besides a match and spinsters and cats? Maybe something else? You're doing it again, Phoebe said kindly. She put a finger to Wendy's mouth. Shh. And then the sisters nodded to each other in full agreement, full of themselves and very happy. I'll send you my card, Class called as they walked off arm in arm. Wendy stood there watching them go, and then looked at Snowball, who gazed dimly back. This could be the beginning of something really big and quite different. If she could do things properly, her lonely days batting around the house by herself would be over. There would be teas and salons and parties and group dog walks and boys and dances and happily ever afters, where she would attend balls and cotilons. I think I said that right. And have a husband and children like Michael and John in a different, perhaps less lonely old house. Was that what she wanted? Was it better or worse than what she had now? Wendy managed one giant breath. It was enough to get her home, running and heaving in a most unladylike fashion. Alright, readjustment. Last but not least, there is Chapter 3, Ireland. When she burst through the front door, Wendy was for the second time that day surprised by the presence of her parents. She was a little frazzled, a dog basket dangling on her left elbow, while she shook out her umbrella with her right hand, and deep, deep in her own thoughts. She needed time to reflect, to figure out the possibilities resulting from her interaction with the Shebo twins. This meant journaling and fiction. With her father home for work early, and the new dog, and everything, it felt like a day out of time, a holiday. So why not spend the afternoon writing up her latest ideas for Neverland? She would indulge herself in the same way other girls did with naps, baths, and dresses. She had been playing with the idea of linking all her stories together somehow, maybe into a novel. Oh, she said, blinking at the unexpected sight of her mother sitting at the kitchen table, her father standing over it, both with very, very serious expressions on their faces, like someone had died. And there, under her father's hand, was the very notebook she had been thinking about. Mother, father, she added, feeling something flutter and flop somewhere between her stomach and heart. A new organ? She told herself crazily. One whose sole purpose is to react to the uncomfortable tension in the air. Wendy, Mr. Darling said in his lowest, most manageable voice. Darling, Mrs. Darling said, I think we had better talk. Mr. Darling coughed suddenly, like he was trying not to look nervous. Wendy had the strange notion of asking if she had been let go from the firm. You read my notebook, she said instead. Yes, and really, sorry, wrong voice. Yes, and really, darling, your writing is quite exquisite, her mother said quickly. Really, I had no idea you were so talented with words. Your descriptions. Your characterizations. Mademoiselle Gabelon had never mentioned your faculty at all. She is unaware. May I have it, please? Wendy said, unable to keep her eyes or attention off her book. The little dog waggled frantically in the basket, causing it to swing. She barely felt it. The thing is, darling, her mother went on, the stories themselves are, well... Oh, enough with this blustering around, Mr. Darling exploded. They are the product of an infantile mind, the furble imaginings of a child. I thought you had done with all this Peter Pan nonsense years ago. You're 16 now. For heaven's sake, Wendy. It's all my fault, Mrs. Darling said apologetically. I have always indulged my baby girl. You haven't changed at all since you were little, Wendy. These silly stories. They aren't silly, Wendy said, offended by the word. Well, yes they are, because they aren't real. None of it is real, Wendy. Not a dish thing. And you write them with yourself in the stories, like you're some kind of hero. Like you're still pretending with your baby brothers. Like you think it's all real. I never believed it was. But her voice caught in her throat. She couldn't do it. She could never knowingly lie about Neverland. She would never betray it that way. Ooh, excuse me. Like I said, I'm fighting off a little cold. Her parents saw her swallow. They saw her hesitation, her refusal to finish the sentence. Her mother's head sank toward her chest, and this hurt Wendy most of all. Mr. Darling cleared his throat again. I think you have some growing up to do, Wendy. I think you need to see the world as it is and what must be done in it to live a full adult life. I think you need a break from these everyone's and thoughts. Father, what are you? The Rennets have a cousin with a country house in Connaught. Your governess had to take a leave of absence on account of her mother passing away. Oh, my bad. Wrong voice, y'all. The Rennets have a cousin in a country house in Connaught. I think that's how you say it. The governess had to take a leave of absence on account of her mother passing away, Mrs. Darling said quietly, almost musically, like delivering the news in the operetta format somehow made it less unappealing. You will join them for 7 months and take care of the 5 boys. Ireland! Wendy cried. It's a long way off. It was the only thing she could think to say. She had been looking at a map of the British Isles just the other day to help fill in some descriptive passages of Neverland, and had been drawn to the country's green meadows and hills. I know, darling, and I will miss you terribly, her mother started. Now stop there. Mr. Darling held up his hand to silence her. Braveheart, we're doing this for her own good. You're sending me to Ireland. You're exiling me to care for a bunch of nasty little boys I don't even know. Think of it as an adventure, like in your stories, Mrs. Darling said brightly. They could be your misplaced boys. Lost boys, Mother. And no, they can't. Well, think of it as a nice little excursion from London then. A vacation, really. You're hiring me out to complete strangers hundreds of miles away just because I write stories about Peter Pan. It wasn't really a question. It was a reaffirming of the facts as presented to her. It's not just about the stories, Mr. Darling said, looking desperately at his wife. Mrs. Darling raised an eyebrow. She may have been soft in many ways, but Wendy's mother never, ever lied. Alright, it is just about the stories, Mr. Darling sighed. And I think you could do with a break from each other for a while. We will keep the notebook safe here with us while you go, Mrs. Darling said soothingly. Peter's got stuff. But they're my stories. They're mine. They belong to me. Mr. Darling threw up his hands. Wendy, we are not the product of a happy, noble. Wendy, they are not the product of a happy, normal girl. No, I suppose not, Wendy cried, and she fled upstairs, the basket with the dog still swinging from her arm. And that is the end of that. I hope you all enjoyed. Hope you all enjoyed me making mistakes here and there, because I get tongue-tied very easily and I have a stutter. And also I can read, but I can't pronounce things very well. So leave a comment if you want me to continue reading. If not, I'm still gonna keep recording. But yeah, I hope you all enjoyed. Like I said, leave a comment if you enjoyed it. If you didn't, you can still leave a comment. Just don't be nasty. And I will see you all next time. Goodbye and good night. Or good morning. Whichever time. I don't know. Toodaloo.